part of it when he said back then, it was not about money. It was about, you have something to say, say it. I thought that was the most profound line I've heard in a long time. Nothing wrong with money, but what's going on? I mean, that's what the 60s were about. It was about reality, not money. And I think that a reason why Edie has become such a cultural signifier of that time is because she represents somehow young people, perhaps come of age since the publication of her biography. I've noticed that there's been a kind of like a cumulative effect over 25 years of young people, usually young girls, coming of age and finding in Edie some kind of a cultural signifier for what's missing from their lives in a simple one word, authenticity. Everything is marketed to them today. And so in Edie, they see someone who's walking on the edge, who was empowered to live a life that was not the life that was prescribed to her by her family, by her tradition and so forth, but to experiment and walk along the edge and find a reality for herself that fit her, even if it was going too far and going way out on the limb. She wrote her own script.
But also, she shows up as a feminist and says, I'm part of the social contract. I'm part of the social contract. I'm going to be, I'm going to participate with full equity. And that was unusual. There wasn't anyone else like that was doing that way.
Well, that's Alice in Wonderland. Andy Warhol's in Alice in Wonderland.
I would say something else about this, which is that I think it wasn't just that she was collaborating in these films and she wanted to record with something that she believed was true, but it was also that she was willing to go to pretty far extremes to experiment with herself, with her own body and her own mind, to try to discover some kind of truth. And obviously that coincided with the moment, the beginning of drug culture, at a moment where people had great faith in new doors that drugs were going to open up, and really, really very little sense of the cost. This next clip is about that, but I will say, for me on this project, the most interesting drug story I've heard, and believe me, I've heard many, is came from someone explaining to me an experience of being at their father-in-law's brunch, very fancy, very old American family, brunch table on a Sunday. The father was the religion writer for Time magazine, and said both to his son and to his daughter-in-law, do you want to come with me? I'm going next week to be with Timothy Leary at Harvard, because I'm going to write about LSD for Time magazine's religion section. And that was how Asa was presented to this young woman in that was probably 63, 62. So as you listen to this next clip, I think it's important to remember that that's the historical context. Oh. Yes, tell me.
What about the notion also related here of inner and outer space? Or that kind of
I was going to
Okay,
get that
fine,
after
okay,
this next
okay.
one. All right, here we go. So David was just mentioning before we started this clip, and I thought that this one would actually be a good one to prompt the question to both of you. This was a time where it was believed that drugs were going to be a way to explore inner space. And in a lot of the tapes that we hear of Edie in the Warhol archives in 1965, she's talking about that. She's talking in a very sort of Eastern religion way, if you will, about ego. And she also believes she can commune with space. And those tapes are pretty interesting. But so you have this inner space exploration going on, and in fact, obviously one of her most amazing movies with Andy is called exactly that, Inner Space and Outer Space. But what about the outer space, and what about space exploration, and how much was that actually a part of the consciousness at that time? Or how did the two things coincide?
Well, remember that for those in the audience who are my decade, the Kennedy assassination was a seminal moment in our lives as youth. It was a dividing line, something between November 22nd, 1963, and a number of, I think 6 months later, when the Beatles arrived in New York at Idlewild Airport, I think just recently named JFK Airport. Big changes took place in society, and when Kennedy the intention to go to the moon, to overcome the Soviet initiative in space, somehow instilled in anyone who was young at the time a notion of the limitless frontiers and what would be possible during our lifetime. And so we used to sit around and talk about space. I mean, we really believed we were going to go to space, that we could get out of this planet, that we could change things. First thing, when I met John Palmer,
He loves
Bob
to tell the
Margolis,
story.
Bob
We
Margolis
all
studio
love
on
this
47th
story.
Street.
John loves this story.
Bob Margolis sitting over here had Andy was on, the factory was on 47th Street, 2nd and 3rd, and Bob Margolis had a studio on West 47th, right off 5th Avenue in the Diamond District, and it was filled with Hasidim and a bunch of hippies on one floor. And when John Palmer came in that day and I met him, the first thing he said was, space. That's where it's at. And we talked about this. I mean, I don't remember what we talked about, but and we were druggies at talking like, ugh. I mean, we really had long, involved, deep conversations about the possibilities. And this was something that Edie focused on a lot. Especially when we hear this, it's hard to remember, but when we have the gift of having these tapes, and it revivifies all of this experience, and we feel the sense of promise. John?
Well, Melissa always admonishes me about getting into theory, but I just can't resist. And so I can't make sense out of any of this without getting into deconstruction, because you can't, with deconstruction, it can't escape itself. And what we do is we go through these layers trying to figure out how it all makes sense in black and white. Those ideas like the pharmacon, the idea of the pharmaceutical component in our lives. And this was such a big deal then, and it's such a big deal now. I think now about the work that I have to do in prisons with methamphetamine addicts. A whole prison full of them. All Hawaiian, which is anomalous, it seems. And I'm taken back to Max Jacobson's office in the 60s and looking at the relationship and thinking about, when Jack Kennedy was in Vienna, and thinking to myself, what does this really mean in our society? How do we get here?
Well, I think you're leaping over some references that people don't. Max Jacobson.
Well, I'll let you do that. Okay.
Yeah, Max Jacobson was a physician on Fifth Avenue who treated Kennedy's, who was Kennedy. Even though the official White House doctor, John Kennedy brought Max Jacobson along to the meeting for Khrushchev in '62, I think it was, because he had his back problems and so forth. And Max Jacobson used to dispense vitamin shots loaded with amphetamine, and his office had rich people and poor people and so forth all waiting for their shots. And there were other versions when Chalman Hadley shot in a kind of Junior League version of Max Jacobson that was called Dr. Robert from the Beatles song. It was Dr. Feelgoods is what they were, because there was a kind of like a whole class of these doctors that would dispense vitamin therapy with speed. And that's what John was referring to. Somehow this was a pioneering, not that speed had been invented in the 60s, that was invented by the Japanese and by the Germans, to make war. But by the time, by the 50s, it became ensconced in Mother's Little Helpers, and by the 60s, it was the glory, or the kind of godlessness that was dispensed to models and artists and so forth that wanted to live fast and do a lot of stuff. Now we're in the busy age. Now the